see the big bead slide. Is that up?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Let me make sure I can advance it before I start. All right. Okay, I think we're good to go. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. And thanks very much to Joe for letting me join today in a different role. My name is Brooke Barron. I live in Harpswell. And prior to my current role in Broadband, I worked at the State House in Augusta, also worked in DC at USDA and on the Hill. I currently work for NTIA, that's the National Telecommunications and Information Agency. That is part of the US Department of Commerce. So NTIA is the agency tasked by Congress with implementing about $50 billion in broadband funding in order to connect every single American to high-speed internet. And that funding came from the bipartisan infrastructure law passed in November 2021 at the federal level. So my title is Federal Program Officer. And what that means is that I'm here in Harpswell, focused solely on Maine, serving to help MCA navigate the many, many requirements that go with these once-in-a-generation grant programs, and to be a resource to communities and stakeholders, and to get tapped into everything that's going on the ground in Maine so that I can share back to DC what is working and what is not. And the idea for this format of me tapping into Let's Talk Broadband once a month was to provide a venue for me and NTIA to provide updates, share resources from NTIA, and also to be a venue for feedback and questions from you all, with the caveat that I only started in this role in October, so I might not have all of the answers, but I do know the very smart people at headquarters and the technical experts, so I'm more than happy to help find the answers if I don't know them at the top of my head. So, with that said, I know that many of you are already well-versed in BEAD and others may not be. So I wanted to take this opportunity to level set. I'm going to present for about 15 minutes and then leave time for questions, and then leave the floor open for the regular Let's Talk Broadband once I get through. So BEAD, what does it stand for? It's the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. It is a mouthful. What is BEAD all about? So our mission is bringing affordable, reliable, high-speed internet to everyone in America. And I'm not going to dwell on these first two slides too much because I think that it really goes without saying in this crowd why high-speed internet is important to all of our work in the community. But just briefly, you are all here because you know that high-speed internet is essential for education, healthcare, economic growth, community connection. That is why you are doing this work, and that's why we're all working together on this. So what I want to talk about is, how do we get there? How do we get to that connection of every American, every Mainer having access to affordable, reliable connection? So that's where BEAD comes in. And I have slides that go into a lot of details and a lot of definitions, and we do have time for all that. But to start, I want to be really clear on the big picture, because BEAD represents a very different approach than what the federal government has ever taken before on broadband. We all know about the many broadband programs the federal government has run over the past decade or two, with folks in DC making decisions about which ISPs and which communities to fund. And this is not that. This is an entirely different model. This is a state effort with a lot of wraparound federal support. That's where I come in, but it's a state effort so that states and communities can get into partnership with each other and then into partnership with ISPs to ensure that the infrastructure we're funding will be affordable, reliable, and universal. And that said, so BEAD is by far the largest of the 4 high-speed internet programs on this slide that are all administered by NTIA. And I hope that at future Let's Talk Broadband meetings, I plan to talk about others, especially digital equity, so that'll have a really big role here in Maine and for all of our work. So level set, because there's a lot of jargon coming up. MCA, Maine Connectivity Authority, Maine's state broadband office, they are the eligible entity here. So MCA will receive BEAD grants and distribute funds to subgrantees. Subgrantees will be entities that receive those funds to carry out eligible entities. And that includes traditional ISPs, co-ops, nonprofits, public-private partnerships, public or private utilities, public utility districts, tribal entities, local governments. This next slide is really more detailed than what we need to get into right now. What the important part of this slide is where we are in the timeline. So we are at the beginning of 2023. So at this point, MCA has received its $5 million in planning funds from NTIA, and they have until August to submit their 5-year plan. So the meat of that 5-year plan will be the selection process for subgrantees, how MCA proposes to divvy up this money across the state. And Kira, from my window, I can't quite see who from MCA is on. Like, feel free to jump in at any point if you'd like to. Just what I'll just say is the important thing to know about the development of that plan, which in Maine is the Broadband Action Plan, or BAP. That will happen. The development of that plan will happen out in public with NTIA support and with the involvement of stakeholders like you all. Kira, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I mean, I think that summary is great, Brooke. We are actually starting to work with our regional and tribal broadband partners, who many of whom I saw sign in and mention that they are on this call, to make sure that we're collecting input and soliciting information from communities across the state. So I think this group will be perfectly targeted in our outreach efforts.
Excellent.
I'm just going to add, if that's okay. We're probably going to sound like a broken record a little bit, but as this is the plan for how we're going to deploy, and BEAD gives us certain guidelines, we get to develop some of our own strategy within it, and we're targeting those areas that are least served, unserved. So if you're sitting around and you have an idea, if you have a solution, if you think like this is what would make the most sense for my community or my area, or have you thought of this? Like, we're going to have, you can directly email, you can reach out through a Let's Talk Broadband or some other way. You can also attend one of our meetings that are going to be both virtual, hybrid, and in person around the state over the next 6 months. But we want to hear it. We need to hear it. And so no idea is too small. It's going to get us thinking and having some of those back and forth conversations of a proposed solution, or have you thought about this piece of legislation that could be tweaked for the future to make it easier? Those are all things that we want to hear that go into that plan, because while we have current programming like Connect the Ready and Reach Me, it doesn't mean that's going to be the exact same programming that is going to fit for BEAD. It might be one solution, but we know that it's probably going to be multiple solutions, because there's really not a one size fits all for the state of Maine. So we want that from ISPs, from community members, from partners. So we're going to have a lot of outreach over the next few months, and hopefully and be working with some of you, especially our regional broadband partners, to do something in your area and bring forward community folks that have been working in broadband and those that haven't.
Excellent. Thank you. So the next, let's see, while we're still on the slide, the next really important milestone will be in June, which is when the funding allocations will be released. So then that's when we'll find out how much money will be coming to Maine. And then 2024 is really when the funding will start flowing out of MCA to the subgrantees. So on that note, let's talk money. Big question, how much money will Maine get and how is that decided? So right off the bat, so BEAD funding includes 3 components. It's based on the new FCC maps. Right off the bat, every state will receive $100 million minimum funding. California gets $100 million, Texas gets $100 million, and Maine gets $100 million. That is obviously a huge benefit to Maine as a small state, puts us at an advantage off the bat. Next, about $4.25 billion will be divided up according to each state's proportion of the total number of high-cost areas. So Maine, with its mountains, its islands, its peninsulas, if Maine has, let's say, 2% of the nation's high cost areas, Maine will receive 2% of that $4.2 billion. And then the remaining funds, which will be around $33 billion, that will be split up based on the number of unserved locations each state has, proportionate to all unserved locations in America. So again, if Maine has 1% of the unserved locations in America, Maine will receive 1% of that remaining $33 billion. And these definitions of served and unserved and what counts as each, that will depend on the FCC maps. It will also depend on how successful the availability challenges to the FCC broadband were. And most estimates put the amount heading to Maine in the neighborhood of $250 million. We will find that out in June. What will BEAD money be spent on? So BEAD money will go to projects that expand reliable high-speed internet. Examples of how that might happen. Funds could be used for deploying or upgrading high-speed internet infrastructure, conducting data collection, broadband mapping, and planning to support program goals, installing or providing reduced cost high-speed internet in a multifamily residential building, supporting broadband adoption, including programs to provide affordable devices, and investing in training and workforce development or other programs to support digital equity. MCA as the eligible entity, they will be selecting projects based on criteria that they have some leeway in creating. Kendra, Joe touched on this a little bit, but to review, BEAD will prioritize complete coverage of unserved locations, then underserved locations, and then, if funding permits, community anchor institutions. So the way the BEAD program defines unserved are locations with speeds of below 25 download, 3 upload, and then underserved will be locations with speeds below 100 download and 20 upload. Community anchor institutions are places like schools, libraries, hospitals, colleges, and the threshold for service there would be a gigabit symmetrical upload download. Something that's really important to understand and a little confusing is that these priorities are based, this is based in order of priority, not in time. So this is how Maine will prioritize spending its funds, not about timing. These things can happen simultaneously, but before working on serving underserved locations, Maine must first have a plan to serve all unserved locations, make sure that they have enough money to know that they will be able to reach every unserved location. And then if funding is left over, Maine could then spend money to serve community anchor institutions. Again, this is confusing. This is an order of priority, not in time. I'm not going to go into all of the details of BEAD because I want to keep time for questions and answers, but to hit on a few top lines, things that are included. BEAD program will include a low-cost broadband service option for all eligible subscribers. Eligible subscribers would be households that meet the definitions that are currently set forth for eligibility for ACP. And MCA will have leeway within these parameters for how it defines those low-cost plans. Additionally, BEAD program has high standards for fair labor practice, workforce development, and climate resiliency. There's a real recognition that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity that Congress created, and we're going to do it right. We may not do it as quickly as everyone wants, but we are going to make sure that we are doing it in a responsible, sustainable way so that these investments last a generation. So I want to end on this slide. Every stakeholder plays a role in the BEAD program. You all who are here are really essential to making this happen. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this conversation, part of this effort. It's going to take all of us working together to make this vision of connecting every American high-speed internet a reality. And there are really important roles to play for the ISPs, for the community organizations, for local governments, for the individuals. So thank you for your partnership. And then lastly, my email address is here. Really happy to be a resource. There's also some other resources. Our internetforall.gov is our website, it has a lot of resources, webinars, some really helpful information and contacts. So thank you. I'm happy to field any questions. And yep, thanks so much for the opportunity.
Cool. Thanks, Brooke. I'm already seeing some questions in the chats. Maybe I can just read them out to you. Paul asked, for distribution of BEAD dollars, is it based on proportion of unserved areas or premises?
So it is based on an unserved location could be just one, as small as one building. So if that answers the question, it could be as small as a single location.
And then Ruben asks, do those speeds include service claimed by Starlink, WISPs, or is it wireline only?
So it is both fiber and licensed wireless. Kendra Jo, did I have that right? So satellite
Yes.
satellite does not qualify. There may be exceptions in locations that are extremely hard to serve that would require an exemption that would be applied for and would have to be granted case by case by the assistant secretary. But generally, it would be fixed wireless and fiber.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
and then,
and I would just add that this is a difference between the funding that we currently have and the funding that's coming in through BEAD, of what the federal agency defines as reliable high-speed internet and a technology that can provide it. So we don't utilize fixed wireless, licensed fixed wireless under CPF, or we don't prioritize it, and we don't view it as being able to provide service or broadband service and symmetrical speeds. Under this program, it will be included, although it's my understanding that we can, when it comes to funding mechanisms, we can prioritize technology preference. So, a fiber first, a cable with DOCSIS 4 second, and then go from there.
Yes, that's absolutely right. MCA will be able to prioritize, and nationwide NTIA asks state broadband offices where if bids are coming in at an equal level to prioritize fiber whenever possible.
gotcha. Cool. Thank you. That's helpful for me too. Amy asked, how will RDOF impact BEAD funding eligibility? Which I think is a question that a lot of towns are facing, especially in Washington County. I know Elaine Abbott's on the chat. She's probably waving her arms about this one, but yeah, I'm curious.
Yes,
well.
I know. And I owe Elaine an email about this as well. Essentially, BEAD dollars cannot be used to overbuild in locations where there is already a federal obligation to build out service. However, we do know that there are cases with RDOF where those obligations are not being met. I am still trying to figure out exactly how this will impact. Kendra Jo, you might know more about this than I do.
So what I know, or what I think I know, is, so there were three RDOF funded providers in Maine: Consolidated, Pioneer, Starlink. The Starlink areas, that funding has been revoked because it was determined that Starlink could not continually provide sustainably provide the level of service required under RDOF. So those areas are all eligible. I think the question that we have had, and I think I know the answer, although I don't want to take it with a grain of salt because I could be wrong. It's my understanding that the RDOF areas that have not been built yet did qualify as unserved locations in the mapping. And so there is funding coming in for those locations, with the understanding that RDOF has a long timeline And so I think in our plan, we have to develop a strategy for those areas and work with the providers that receive that funding and identify what their timeline is for finishing out those builds, right? If they have what, 6 years or a little less than that now. We have to identify, are those timelines going to align with our BEAD funding deployment? Are they committed to serving them or not? We've seen in the past where when you have a timeline that long, sometimes you get to the end of it and not all of those builds were completed and that funding gets returned or it doesn't get drawn down. And then those communities are left behind because they were completely disqualified in the in-between. And I think one good thing about BEAD funding is it doesn't disqualify those communities. It doesn't disqualify us from getting funding for those unserved locations because they are just that still, even though they're earmarked for a program that has a long build timeline. And I think that's still some questions we're developing around RDOF. And again, for places like Washington and a lot of our rim counties that saw RDOF impact their communities, and in a lot of cases it doesn't completely cover your community. It leaves behind, it's kind of like Swiss cheese all over the place. We have to develop a strategy that's going to partner with and offset those RDOF locations.
So for those towns that do have RDOF kind of promised to them, in the case that maybe that doesn't pan out, is there going to be any recourse for those communities if, let's say 6 years from now, and they figure out that, they've been left behind by this BEAD funding, or at least the implementation process? Like, will the MCA have something for them, or, I don't know who that comes from, but I'm curious about that, just that part of what you said, in terms of, what if the RDOF doesn't pan out?
Well, I think that's the conversation that we have to have with those providers, right? They have to have a build timeline and a plan to reaching all of those RDOF areas by the end of their grant award, or by the end of that award, or not. And we have funding designated for those locations as well, if they are considered unserved. So I would hope, given that there's kind of 2 batches of funding dedicated to those areas, because they are, the reason they were in RDOF is because they were some of the least served areas of the state for that reverse option, that we'll be able to get to a point where, it's not just them getting covered, but an entire community getting finished out. And I think now that at least the conversations that I've recently had with the 2 providers in the state around RDOF is they have a much better projection of when they're going to those areas and how they're trying to leverage either their own investments to finish out those communities or state funding while they can to finish them out. So, and I know this is a piece that Tanya is going to keep digging into because it is existing funding. It's probably not going to be the last federal funding that comes in the BEAD timeline, or even the RDOF timeline. So it is something we have to balance. But I think we learned from CAF2 funding and even USDA funding in the past of, like, when you completely disqualify an area under like CAF2, which was back in, I think, 2018. And then those builds didn't come to fruition. Those communities got left behind because the other funding couldn't go to them either. So I think one mechanism within this is, like, we have that RDOF area in mind, and something has to pan out there, either RDOF or BEAD.
Cool. There's a couple different follow-ups to this conversation in the chat that I'm jumping a couple questions, but I just wanted to kind of finish up the conversation here. But Elaine asks, is it right that ISPs with extensions have closer to 10 years to do to like work in these RDOF areas? And then Amy added, how can they be a part of this solution as a community that's directly impacted by RDOF, by this problem that we're talking about now?
Kendra Jo, is that something you want to touch on more about the stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, I think every community, whether you have RDOF or not, should be involved, because again, I don't think RDOF, I think it's very few where RDOF covered an entire community. So we also have to recognize that there are parts of communities that still need service in partnership with RDOF. And if it's the incumbent provider that's that RDOF awardee or another provider that's doing that or not, we have to kind of figure out how to lasso those areas into some kind of infrastructure build to make sure that they are served. So yeah, again, I feel like this is like a to be planned, but an area where if a community has RDOF funding in it, it's helpful to start hearing what that means when you're actually looking at both the infrastructure and how it plays out for the social and economic resilience of that community. So I would encourage either through your regional broadband partner or directly to be engaged in some of these conversations. And so we can keep bringing up or bringing to light any tensions that RDOF might be playing within BEAD funding allocation and distribution.
And Elaine, to your question, I do think that 10 years might, that does sound like something I've heard as well. I will have to check through my notes and I'll add that to my list to get back to you on.
Zooming out a little bit, Christian asked, what is the estimated cost in Maine's overall internet shortfall? And would BEAD be expected to cover all uncovered locations ultimately? Which is the big question.
That's a really big question. It is how BEAD is envisioned. But it will really depend. It will really depend. And I think that MCA is doing a lot of work with the Broadband Action Plan to figure out how to stretch the dollars as far as possible. It's certainly the goal to serve every unserved location. It's also dynamic. I mean, with all of the other grant programs and private investment coming in, you know, things just change month to month, if not day to day. So we certainly hope and expect that, and it will take a lot of work to make that happen also.
So I hesitate to give a number. I know past reports for Maine have said somewhere around $600 million is the gap, depending on how you look at what served and unserved is, and what technology is included in that, to kind of shifts that number either a lot higher or a little less. We don't, for the main criteria, we don't have enough funding for it. You know, if we're looking at areas across the state that don't have service or are the least served, right? So just as an example, if we include fixed wireless, it's about 32,000 locations that are least served, so under 25/3. If we don't include fixed wireless, it jumps to over 100,000 locations, right? So it's a big difference, and it comes back to, you know, what are we talking about and what's the scope of broadband that we're defining and the technology that can be used to address it. And it's part of the reason why we piloted Jumpstart, is to figure out if there are new technologies in the fixed wireless and LTE space that can provide symmetrical speeds, or at least get you to a point where the reliability is much stronger than it has been in the past, than we've seen in the past. It's why we're seeing the deployment of 2 different new types of technologies under that program. I think all of those will be the 3 awards within that program will be launched by this summer, and we'll start to see the testing of that equipment within Maine. We know the marketed speeds and what we're told it can do. We haven't seen it deployed in Maine to the same extent. So there's a bit of learning there, but just, yeah, I just wanted to give that example of, you know, when we just that one shift in technology, you know, 3 times the number of least served. So, and then again, I think people could do it back of the napkin, but the cost, the like back of the napkin cost of price per premise passed, or even a mile of fiber, is constantly changing because the cost not only of the supply is going up, but also labor. And we saw in the workforce report that came out last week from MCA, there's a huge shortage of labor workforce across the state and the country when it comes to broadband deployment. So yeah, can start to do the numbers in your back of your mind, but I just wanted to give that example, if that helps, Christian.
Paul, I see your comment about RDOF funds should be merged into BEAD dollars because it presents a huge challenge for ISPs to build RDOF blocks given the current cost of fiber builds and sporadic arrangement of the blocks. My house is in a block with only has 3 other homes included, not the other 25 east and west of me that are also unserved. Confusing logic. Yeah, we've heard a lot of these problems on the ground with RDOF. The idea of merging into BEAD funds, while that might solve some problems, that would require congressional action. And a lot of the requirements that are set forth here in BEAD were set forth in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So, there are areas where NTIA is providing leeway to MCA on how they can deploy these resources, but a lot of the technicalities are actually prescribed by Congress and would require congressional action to change.
Ruben is asking a question about if there's room to allow an ISP to deploy something like Toronto, which is a fixed wireless system, to connect homes who are waiting to get fiber as a way of paying customer or getting customers online faster before fiber shows up in their communities, and then moving the Toronto or the fixed wireless solution elsewhere in the state and doing the same thing. And I'm curious if that's something that is being kind of considered as a creative solution to this.
I can take this if you want, Brooke. It's one of the solutions that came through Jumpstart. So for Lee and Lakeville, Outer Reach Broadband, which is based out of Hollowell, is trying to implement this exact approach. They are deploying Toronto, once the roads are passable in May. They're going to deploy Toronto on a tower in Lee. It's going to reach both Lee and Lakeville, and then their second phase is to backfill with fiber first to the homes that the fixed wireless is not reaching because of hills and trees and leaf coverage, and then get the entirety of Lee and Lakeville covered in fiber. It was an approach we didn't think was going to come through Jumpstart, and it did. So we're excited to see what that looks like for them. They're a small, newer company, and I know they're deploying. They've deployed Toronto in Millinocket, and they're deploying in 3 more communities this weekend, although I don't know where. Yeah, so that seems to be their approach of let's get a short-term fixed wireless solution that we believe is much better than those we've seen in the past, and then backfill into fiber for a long-term solution. I can give you the contact I have for Outer Reach Broadband, Tom Kirby, and you could ask from there. We have not, we haven't been able to, because it's not deployed yet, we haven't been able to evaluate this pilot solution in particular, and I'm not quite sure what his cost breakdown looks like. And we would see that hopefully in one of our next application rounds for Connect the Ready.
I want to make sure that we're leaving time for other topics as well, but I hope that you all will reach out to me with questions or anything you want to share, also for ideas for what topics would be helpful to be covered in future iterations of this meeting. So really very open to feedback and ideas.
Yeah, any final questions for Brooke? And if not, we can kind of move on to our, I guess, regularly scheduled programming, although this will be regularly scheduled as well going into the future. No, we're okay for now.
Great.
Yeah, I don't want to but Brooke's email is on the slide deck right now. She is super responsive via email. Similarly, it's I know that myself, if you want to get in contact with me about any of the stuff we talked about today, or I'm sure Kendra Joe would be a great resource as well. So yeah, thank you, Brooke.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Great. I might take it off recording now too, just because, you know, we can get back to more of our stop recording.